4 men attacked Winnie Shaw in the middle of Amargo Main Street, and what happened next would cost the whole dour crew everything they thought they owned. I was there, friend. Leaning against the mercantile awning with a tin cup going cold in my hand, and I watched every second of what unfolded that morning. Watched those 4 men in dour crew dusters close around a woman who hadn't weighed 100 pounds soaking wet. Watched the bought sheriff find something fascinating to study in his boot heel. And I watched the quiet stranger over by the hitching post outside Halverson's feed store, the one nobody in Amargo had ever laid eyes on before that morning, set down his sack of flour, look at what was happening to Winnie, and walk into the street. He warned them once. What the dour crew did after that warning is the kind of story that gets told in Arizona territory on cold nights when the fire burns low. And I will tell it to you straight, because I was there, and because Winnie Shaw deserves to have her name spoken right. Her name was Winnie Shaw. Summer of 1883, Amargo, Arizona territory. A cattle crew had been running her off her dead husband's land claim for 3 weeks, and the quiet stranger who was about to walk into the middle of it had a name the worst men in the territory already feared, even if they didn't yet know it was him standing there by the hitching post. Stay with me to the end of this one. You will not be sorry you did. Now, let me take you back to the beginning. Amargo sat on a flat pan of scrub and alkaline dust about 60 miles north of the Mexican line, a town that had no reason to exist, except that water existed there. And where there is water in the desert, there will eventually be men arguing over who owns it. The main street was wide enough to turn a freight wagon with room to spare, a hotel with a lopsided false front, a saloon that never really closed, a barber shop, 3 dry goods establishments, a blacksmith who doubled as a dentist on Thursdays, and at the near end of the street, adjacent to the post road, a laundry operation run out of a 2-room adobe by a woman named Winnie Shaw. Winnie had come to Amargo 4 years prior as the bride of a man named Tom Shaw, who had homesteaded 80 acres of decent grazing land on the western edge of town and run a small herd of mixed cattle that were not beautiful, but stayed alive through the dry months because Tom was careful and patient and knew how to find water. Tom Shaw was a good man by every measure I ever heard applied to him. Patient with animals and with people, and with the kind of slow, grinding work that desert homesteading actually is, rather than the version of it that gets romanticized in the dime novels. He died in the spring of 1882, taken by a fever that moved through that part of the territory, fast and hard, and left a number of families missing their fathers and husbands. The kind of sickness that doesn't care what you've built, or what you intended to do next. What Tom left behind, besides the grief, was the claim. 80 acres with a creek-fed stock pond on the western edge, and a good grass stand in the middle that any rancher with eyes could see was worth 3 times what it looked like from the road. He left Winnie the deed, proper and recorded at the county seat. He left her the adobe with the 2 rooms and the iron wash tubs. He left her a business because Winnie had turned the laundry operation into something real during their years together, pulling trade from the cattlemen and miners and railroad surveyors who passed through Amargo and needed their shirts handled by someone who knew what she was doing. She was 26 years old when Tom died, dark-haired and fine-featured, with a composure that struck people who didn't know her as coldness, and that people who did know her understood was just the way Winnie Shaw held herself when the world was giving her reasons not to. She had no family within 500 miles. She had a business and a land claim and a dead husband's name and enough stubbornness to fill a freight car. She had the customers Tom had built up. men who came back because she did the work right, and charged fairly, and didn't complain about the state the laundry arrived in, which was sometimes very bad indeed. She had a reputation in that town for reliability, which in a frontier settlement is not a small thing. For about 14 months, nobody bothered her. Then the Dower brothers bought the Kettle Creek Ranch. There were 3 of them, and I will give you each in turn. Ellis Dower was the eldest and ran the operation. 43 years old, built like something quarried out of a hillside, with a face that had been rearranged at least twice and that wore the permanent expression of a man who had decided in advance that whatever you're about to say is not worth his time. Ellis Dower had come up through the Texas cattle trades during the ugly years and had convictions about land and water that he held the way other men hold religious faith, without any requirement for evidence or argument. He wanted the Shaw claim because the stock pond on its western edge was the only reliable water source within 4 miles of the Kettle Creek Range in a dry year, and in a dry year that stock pond was worth more than the cattle it watered. He had made Winnie a fair offer. She had declined it. He had made an unfair offer, and she had declined that too. He had then instructed his crew to begin making the alternative argument, the one that didn't require paper. Trace Dower was the middle brother, 10 years younger than Ellis and half a head shorter, who compensated for both facts with a temper that ran close to the surface and a taste for liquor that made the temper worse. Trace was the kind of man who had never in his life been told no by anyone who could make it stick. He was the one who appeared at Winnie's laundry on 3 separate occasions with final notices of one kind or another. He was the one who knocked over her washtubs twice and called it an accident both times, with a grin that said he found his own lie amusing. He was also the one who would make the worst decision of the morning I'm describing, which I will get to in time. The 3rd member of the Dower crew who matters to this story was not a brother at all. His name was Cale Pickett, and he had ridden with Ellis Dower since Texas, and understood that his place in the outfit depended entirely on his willingness to do the things Ellis needed done but didn't want done in his own name. Pickett was lean and quiet, and had a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and the men who knew him from his Texas days would have told you, if you pressed them, that he was the most dangerous of the 3 precisely because he never lost his temper and never seemed to feel anything particular about what he did. He operated the way a cold machine operates. You pointed him at a problem, and he resolved it. These were the men who ran the Dower crew. And the bought sheriff, whose name I will give you, and whose choices I will describe without satisfaction, because I think satisfaction at a man's ruin is its own kind of ugliness, was a man called Norbert Hale. Hale had been Amargo's lawman for 6 years, and had been the Dower family's insurance policy for 3 of them. I want to be fair to him, because corruption that grows by inches over a long time is a different thing than corruption that arrives all at once and announces itself. Hale had taken the first small accommodation and then the second, and by the time the Dower brothers arrived and made their arrangement with him, the accommodations had become so routine he'd stopped recognizing them as what they were. He wore his badge. He kept a certain kind of peace. When the Dower crew rode into Amargo and threw its weight around, Hale developed an extraordinary capacity for not being in the vicinity. The 3 weeks before the morning I'm describing had been a campaign. That is the only word for it. The Dower crew began by letting Winnie's fences down. Then they cut her water supply, diverting the secondary channel that fed her kitchen pipe, so that she had to carry water from the main well at the center of town in the heat of July. Then Cale Pickett appeared at her door on a Sunday evening and explained to her, in his flat and perfectly pleasant voice, that the situation was only going to escalate, and that the sensible course was for her to take the money Ellis was still willing to offer and move along, somewhere more comfortable, somewhere better suited to a woman on her own. Winnie Shaw did not move along. She filed a complaint with Sheriff Hale. Hale wrote it down in his ledger and promised he'd look into it. He did not look into it. She wrote a letter to the county seat, requesting an inquiry into the fence and water interference. The county seat was 60 miles away and understaffed, and had 14 other complaints from smaller landholders facing similar pressure from similar operations, and the letter produced nothing for 3 weeks, and then produced a polite acknowledgment of receipt. She spoke to her neighbors. Her neighbors were, to a person, sympathetic and frightened and unwilling to put themselves crosswise of the Dower brothers over a dispute that wasn't theirs. She could not blame them. She understood fear. She was alone. She knew she was alone. She kept working. The Tuesday morning in question was market day in Amargo, which meant the main street was as busy as it got, which meant there were 40 or 50 people who were in a position to see what happened when Ellis finally ran out of patience and decided that public streets were as good a venue as any for making his point. I should tell you what market day looked like in Amargo in those years, because the setting matters to what follows. The freight wagons came in from the east road before sunup, the big Studebakers with their canvas covers gone gray from the alkali dust, and by the time the sun cleared the ridgeline, the street was already moving. Ranchers and their hands, a few homesteaders in from the outlying parcels, the mining company's supply agent, who appeared every third Tuesday with a long list and a purse that was always $3 lighter by the time he got to the mercantile. Women with baskets, children running the spaces between the wagons with a freedom they wouldn't be allowed in another hour when the grown-ups got their bearings. Amargo was not a prosperous town, but on market day it had the energy of one, the particular busy sound of people who have driven a long way and have real business to finish before the afternoon heat made everything miserable. All of which meant there were witnesses to what was about to happen. Not that any of them were going to step forward, but they were there, and they saw it, and they would be there to see what came next too. Winnie had set out before dawn to deliver 3 bundles of clean laundry to customers on the far end of town, the way she did every Tuesday, walking the street with the bundles balanced and her head up. She was on her return trip, the sun just clearing the eastern ridgeline and turning the dust gold, when Ellis Dower and Trace and Cale Pickett stepped out of the alley beside the hardware store and spread across the street in front of her. She stopped. Ellis spoke. I was too far away to catch the words, but I could see his hands, and his hands were in the posture of a man delivering a final statement, rather than an invitation to discuss. Winnie held herself very still. Trace moved to her left, and Pickett moved to her right. And the thing about 3 men doing that to one woman on a public street is that it doesn't require any specific action to be threatening. The geometry itself is the threat. The geometry says, there is no direction you can go that we are not already in. She answered Ellis, her chin lifting as she did. Whatever she said, his face tightened. Then Trace Dower grabbed her arm. That was when the stranger moved. He had been at Halverson's hitching post for the better part of an hour, which I knew because I had watched him arrive on a bay horse that was road-worn but well kept. He'd gone inside for supplies and come back out with a flour sack and a canvas parcel, and settled into a particular kind of stillness, Not sleepiness, but something more deliberate. The stillness of a man who is watching the ground around him the way careful men do in unfamiliar country. He was on the south side of 40, lean-built without being thin, wearing trail clothes that had been good quality about 3 years ago and had been worn hard in the time since. A single revolver on his right hip, worn low in the way that is either an affectation or the product of long practice, and nobody who was paying attention was going to mistake it for an affectation. He set his parcels on the porch boards and walked into the street. Not fast, not slow, just walking. With that quality of movement that certain men have. The ones who have been in enough situations that they no longer waste anything that isn't useful. He crossed the distance between the hitching post and the 3 dour men in about 12 steps, and stopped close enough to Trace that Trace had to let go of Winnie's arm to deal with the proximity. Trace looked at him. Trace was not a man who backed up without complaint. The stranger looked at Trace Dower for a moment in the way you look at something you have already worked out the answer to, then at Ellis, then at Pickett, each in turn, long enough to let each man understand he'd been seen and assessed. He did not rush the looking. "Put your hands on her again," he said, "and I'll answer it." That was the whole of the warning. No raised voice, no hand on the revolver. One sentence, delivered in a tone that had the particular quality of something that has been said before and followed through on before, and that everyone within earshot somehow understood to be exactly that kind of sentence. Trace Dower's instinct was to answer the warning the way men like Trace usually answer a warning from a stranger, with contempt and counter-threat. He squared up and started to say his piece. Ellis said nothing, because Ellis was watching the stranger the way I have seen men watch something they're not entirely sure they've correctly identified. There was a calculation happening behind Ellis Dower's eyes that hadn't been happening 30 seconds before. Ellis cut Trace off. He told Pickett to leave the woman alone. The 3 of them walked back toward the alley, Trace throwing one look over his shoulder that was as ugly as anything I've seen on a man's face in 40 years in the territory. They left. Winnie Shaw stood in the middle of Amargo's main street, with her chin still up and her hands very still at her sides. The stranger walked back to the hitching post and picked up his parcels. I want to stop here and subscribe to what just happened, because I'm aware it could sound, from the outside, like a small thing. One stranger walking into a street and saying one sentence. But those of us who were on that street that morning knew we had seen something. Couldn't have named it right away, but we felt it. The geometry of the whole morning had changed, not just the immediate standoff, but something about what Amargo was going to be allowed to be going forward. You feel that sometimes, when something shifts. Now, if you are new to this channel and this kind of story, I would invite you to subscribe. We put these out regularly, and they keep coming. Where are you listening tonight? What time is it where you are? Drop that in the comments. I like to know what corners of the world are sitting with these stories. Back to Amargo. Back to 1883. That confrontation in the street should have been the end of it by any reasonable reckoning. But the end of it depended on the Dower brothers being the kind of men who took warnings. They were not. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to give you more of Winnie, because she deserves more than the compressed account I've given you. And because what she did in the days that followed matters more than anything any man in this story did, though the men did plenty. Winnie Shaw was afraid. I want to be plain about that. She was not constructed of something harder than ordinary feeling, and there were thoughts she couldn't let herself hold too long, because if she did, the fear would close around her like a fist. Tom was gone. There was no one coming to help. The law was bought. The neighbors were silent. She had been running on the edge of that fear for 3 weeks, getting through each morning and each evening by reducing the problem to its smallest possible unit. What do I need to do in the next hour? She was running that calculation when Trace Dower grabbed her arm. She was running it when the stranger walked back to his horse. Back at the laundry that afternoon, she was at the wash tub when she heard boots on her step and looked up to find the stranger in her doorway with his hat in his hand. He gave her the whole shape of it. He had seen enough of the morning to understand the situation. He had business at the assay office that would keep him in Amargo 2 more days, and if the Dower crew laid hands on her or her property again during those 2 days, he would be available to address it. Winnie looked at him the way she looked at things she needed to fully understand before deciding about them. "I don't know your name," she said. "Gideon." Just the one name without a second attached. She thanked him for what he'd done that morning. Then she went back to the wash tub and he left, and she watched him go from the side of her eye. That night, lying on her narrow bed with the desert wind working through the gaps in the adobe walls, Winnie turned over what she knew, which was not much. A stranger had done one thing once. He might do nothing more. She recognized something in the way he'd worn that revolver, not the way most men wore a gun, which is as a declaration, but the way a working implement gets worn by someone who actually uses it. She filed him under unknown quantities and went to sleep. Down the other end of Amargo that same night, in the back room of the saloon that Ellis Dower had made his informal headquarters, Cale Pickett was making inquiries. This was Pickett's function. When something appeared in the terrain that Ellis couldn't classify, he sent Pickett to classify it. And the stranger who had walked into the street that morning with nothing but a single quiet sentence was something that needed classifying. Pickett talked to the barkeep. He went to the assay office and made conversation with the clerk. He sent a telegram to a contact in Tucson whose business was knowing the faces and histories of men who moved through the cattle country. The telegram came back the following morning. I don't know exactly what was in it. What I can tell you is that I saw Cale Pickett emerge from the telegraph office and walk to the saloon. When he came back out 15 minutes later, his face had undergone some rearrangement. Not fear, exactly. Recalculation. His eyes were moving differently, scanning, landing on things and not quite settling on them. He found Ellis that afternoon in the back of the feed store. I was near enough to the door to catch pieces of the exchange. Pickett's voice, low and flat, saying a name. Ellis's response, a single short word. Then silence. The name Pickett said was Gideon Cross. If you have spent any time in Arizona territory in the years I'm talking about, you have heard that name. If you haven't, here is the short accounting. Gideon Cross had ridden with the Territorial Marshal's office for 7 years and before that with a ranger unit out of West Texas, and during the course of that work had acquired a reputation that was specific and consistent. He did not miss. He did not bluster. He gave one warning, and he meant it, and the men on the other side of his warnings who had chosen not to believe it were, uniformly, no longer in a position to testify about their mistake. He had survived more direct confrontations than any working lawman I knew of at that age, and the reason he was still alive at 40 while the men he'd faced were not, was discussed throughout the territory. The consensus being that Gideon Cross was simply more accurate and more economical in the work than anyone he'd ever encountered. He had left the marshal's office 2 years prior, circumstances unclear in any account I'd heard, and had since moved through the territory on the edge of the legal trade, taking work where he found it, never staying long. One story said he'd killed a man he shouldn't have and couldn't live with it. Another said he'd killed a man he should have killed sooner, and that was worse somehow. I don't know which is true. What matters is that when Pickett said that name in the feed store, Ellis Dower understood that the stranger who had walked into his business with nothing but a single sentence was not a random passerby. He was a man with a very specific history, and that history said the warning was not theater. Now, there are two kinds of men when they discover they have accidentally backed into a confrontation with someone genuinely dangerous. The first kind reassesses and finds another way. The second kind doubles down, because to them, backing away from anything, even from a position that will cost them, feels like a kind of dying. Ellis Dower was the second kind. He had come too far and spent too much money on too many arrangements to fold now over one man, even this particular man. But he wasn't careless. He sent Pickett to hire 2 additional riders that afternoon. And he sent a message to a man in the county seat, a man of some legal standing whose name I will not put in this account, requesting that certain protections be readied in the event that matters in Amargo became formally complicated. This was the land ring. That is what I need you to understand before the story comes to its conclusion. Because the Dower brothers were not the whole of it. They were the visible piece of a larger structure that had been quietly assembled over 3 years by men whose names would not appear on any fence line or water claim, but who held the financial interests that made the pressure campaigns worth running. 7 investors based in Tucson and 1 in Prescott, money from back east that had correctly identified 2 things: that land in the Arizona Territory was dramatically underpriced in 1883, and that the key to controlling land value in a desert territory was controlling water rights. The plan was not complicated. Find the landholders sitting on the critical water access points, apply pressure until they sold, and build a web of legal accommodations at the county level to make the transfers stick. 11 smaller holdings had already been absorbed. Winnie Shaw's 80 acres with the stock pond on its western edge was the keystone of the next cluster. Without it, 3 other targeted acquisitions became strategically worthless. That is what Winnie had been standing against, without knowing its full shape. She knew there was more to it than one rancher wanting 1 stock pond. She was right. That same evening, Gideon Cross spent an hour in the assay office with the claim records. By the time he walked out into the cool dark, he had the general outline of the ring. He went to Winnie's laundry. She was still working, because she always was in the evenings, running the wringer on the week's last load. Her arms red to the elbow from the hot water. He sat on the step without asking and laid out what he'd found. He didn't soften it. He told her the stock pond claim was the cornerstone of an investment scheme that went well above Ellis Dower, that the men behind it had legal cover built in at the county level, and that a complaint to the local sheriff was always going to produce nothing because the local sheriff was part of the construction. She set down the wringer handle. The silence between them held for a moment. She'd already understood most of it, she said. She hadn't known the names or the full geography, but she'd understood the scope. "Who in this town do you trust?" he said. 2 people, she told him. Foss, the barber, who had been a friend of Tom's, and Mrs. Kathleen Ibarra, who ran the hotel and had let Winnie sleep in a storeroom during the worst cold snap of the previous winter, when her pipes froze and there was no heat. 2 people in a town of 300. Gideon Cross nodded as though this confirmed something he'd already estimated. He needed a place to stay that wasn't a public hotel room, he explained, in terms that required no interpretation. Sleeping at the hotel meant Pickett's men knew exactly where he was, and when his eyes were closed. She thought about it for a moment. The second room of the adobe was storage, she told him. But it had a floor and a roof. He said that would do. The next morning, he did not leave. He spent the early hours on a stool at the workbench while Winnie washed and folded, asking questions about the land, the stock pond, the fencing arrangements, the access routes from the main road. She gave him the details in the order that was useful. He listened with the particular quality of attention that builds a complete picture from pieces, asking a question a second time only once, and then only because she'd given him 2 different measurements for the eastern fence line. In the afternoon he walked the property with her, going to the back edge where the scrub ran up toward a low ridge to the north. He showed her 3 points where a nighttime approach would come from if it came, and explained what made each one attractive to someone arriving quiet and intending surprise. He was not performing the explanation. He was informing her, the way you inform someone who is going to need to act on the information. "Can you shoot?" he asked. Tom had taught her. Rifle, not revolver. She hadn't fired it in 2 years. He brought the rifle out and watched her fire 6 rounds at a fence post from 50 yards, adjusting her stance once with a brief word about where her weight was sitting. She was not a natural, but she was steady under attention. In his experience, that was the rarer quality and the more useful one. Over the next 4 hours, using materials from the shed and the laundry store room, and 1 purposeful trip to the hardware store, he turned Winnie Shaw's property into something that was not a fortress, but was a very inhospitable place to arrive at in the dark if you didn't know what was waiting for you. Trip lines at the 3 approach points he'd identified. A bell line across the back fence, strung low and quiet so it caught a boot rather than announcing itself visually. 2 positions on the main structure from which someone with a rifle could cover the yard without being silhouetted. A lantern arrangement on the far side of the property designed to create a visible point of light that pulled attention away from the actual structure. He explained each element to Winnie as he built it. Why here and not there? What it caught and what it missed. She asked 2 questions. The rest of the time she watched and listened with the focused composure that he was by now, beginning to recognize as simply how Winnie Shaw moved through the world when things required it. The hardware store trip produced 1 additional element that I should describe, because it mattered in the end. He came back with a coil of thin wire, the kind used for fencing repairs, and a handful of tin can lids salvaged from the store's scrap barrel for a nickel. He strung these at knee height between 2 fence posts on the north approach, the one he rated least likely for the primary entry, but most likely for the flanking man, the one who was supposed to come wide and create confusion. The tin lids made no noise at rest. In motion, in the dark, they produced a sound like a very small and very surprised percussion section. It was not a sophisticated device. It was exactly effective enough for what it needed to do, which was to give 30 seconds of warning to someone who knew what it meant. "You've done this before," she said at one point, not as a question. "Yes." "What happens if they don't come tonight?" "We do it again tomorrow, and the next night." She thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about something else. "You said 2 days. At the assay office." He let a beat pass before he answered. The business had changed, he said, when he looked at what he found in those claim records. She didn't push further on that. She understood what kind of man would change his plans for a reason like that, and she understood what kind of man would say as little about it as possible. That evening, Gideon Cross ate the meal Winnie put in front of him, which was beans and salt pork and cornbread and nothing decorative, and he ate it with the focused efficiency of a man for whom a meal is fuel and not ceremony, and when he was done, he washed his own plate without being invited to. Winnie noticed this and did not comment on it. Winnie Shaw sat at her front window with Tom's rifle across her knees, and Gideon Cross 2 feet away in the dark, not touching, not quite talking, waiting. The wind off the desert was warm and carried sage. The town at the far end of the street made its usual evening sounds. Winnie thought about Tom, the particular way he'd sit in this same room on summer evenings, easy and quiet in the way of men who have made their peace with where they are. She thought about the 80 acres and the stock pond and the grass stand that had kept going because someone tended it right. She thought about the whole accumulated weight of choices that had brought her to this specific dark, with a rifle on her knees, and a man she'd known for 2 days sitting beside her. She was not sorry about any of it. That, more than anything, was what surprised her. The desert at 2 in the morning has a particular quality of silence that people who have only experienced it from inside a building don't fully understand. It is not the absence of sound. It is a kind of active quiet, the hum of insects, the shift of the warm air, the far-off sound of a coyote working the ridgeline north of town, and underneath all of that, a deep ground-level stillness that makes every out-of-place noise carry with perfect clarity. Gideon Cross had spent enough nights like this in enough different terrain that he'd learned to filter it the way you filter a crowded room, letting the background run, waiting for the frequency that didn't belong. They came at 2 in the morning, 4 men, not 3. 2 from the back ridge, which Gideon had named as the primary approach, 1 from the east fence, 1 going wide around the north end of the yard, every approach point exactly where he'd said. The bell line on the back fence came alive first, a small bright sound in the still night, and both of them were on their feet before it finished ringing. "East fence," he said. "Then the ridge. Don't fire until I tell you." She didn't. What happened in the next 7 minutes I can only piece together from what Winnie described afterward and what was visible in the morning light. The trip lines at the 2 ridge approaches caught in sequence, sending 2 men stumbling in the dark and announcing their positions without ceremony. Gideon Cross moved through the dark the way certain men do, without sound, which I mention again because I find it remarkable every time I think about it. He fired twice, warning shots, both of them, aimed at the earth close enough to the stumbling men to make the argument with absolute clarity without putting lead in anyone. The 2 men from the ridge ran. Cale Pickett had entered the yard from the east fence before the ridge came alive. He was the one who'd gotten past the bell line, the one who moved like the professional he was, no wasted motion, no noise. He was standing 6 feet from the back wall of the adobe when Winnie Shaw stepped through the back door with Tom's rifle leveled at the gatepost where he could see it plainly in the moonlight. She told him to put his hands up. Pickett looked at the rifle, looked at her face, ran whatever calculation Pickett ran in moments like this. Whatever came out on the other side of that calculation, it was not what Ellis Dower was paying him to produce. He put his hands up. The 4th man, the one who'd gone north, had run at the first shots and did not stop. When dawn came, he was 30 miles east and still moving in that direction, according to the accounts that trickled back later. They held picket through the night. In the morning, Gideon Cross went to find Norbert Hale. He found him at the hotel at breakfast, sitting alone at the window table with a plate going cold in front of him. Gideon sat down across from him and put the documentation between them. The copied claim records from the assay office, the pattern of acquisitions annotated in the margins in his careful hand. The names of the county seat investors, obtained from the telegraph operator, who had kept the outgoing message copies as a matter of legal record. And Cale Pickett, sitting outside the hotel door with his wrists bound, who had spent the night reconsidering the extent of his loyalty to Ellis Dower, and had arrived at some conclusions that were useful to other people. Hale looked at the papers for a long time. He was not, in that moment, the compliant tool of the Dower interests. He was a man looking at the full shape of what he had spent 3 years helping build and seeing it from the outside for what it was. He knew what Ellis would do when he found out about Pickett's situation. He said so. Gideon Cross said he expected Ellis would come to town. That was the idea. The look Hale gave him at that had something in it that I don't think was fear. Exactly. It was something more like the feeling of a man who has just realized the ground he thought was solid was not. What came out in the next 2 hours, as Hale went through the records and Pickett answered questions with the cooperative energy of a man whose priorities had recently reordered themselves, was the full shape of the ring. 7 investors in Tucson, 1 in Prescott, 11 land parcels in the current acquisition phase, legal arrangements at the county level to expedite claim transfers. Hale's role in the construction, spelled out in plain terms, which was to provide the official non-interference that kept the pressure campaigns out of public record and out of any formal investigation. The land wasn't worth what the investors had spent building the arrangement, not yet. In 15 years, when the railroad expansion that everybody in the territory could see coming had actually arrived, it would be worth 20 times the investment. Hale sat with it all for a long time. Gideon Cross waited. "What you do next," Gideon said finally, in the tone of a man who says a thing once and doesn't repeat it, "is the only thing that matters. Not what came before. What you do right now." Hale looked at him, at the badge on his own shirt, at the window and the street beyond it. He took the badge off and put it on the table. Then he went to the telegraph office. He sent a message to the territorial marshal in Prescott. He sent a second message to the county sheriff, who was not inside the ring and who Hale had been, it turned out, inadvertently shielding from the ring's operations through his own choices. When the county sheriff learned about it, his reaction was not forgiving, but it was thorough. That brought us to the afternoon. Ellis Dower rode into Amargo at 3 o'clock with Trace and 2 hired riders, not knowing about Pickett, not knowing about the telegrams, not knowing that Gideon Cross had spent the night doing exactly what Hale's full accounting now described. Ellis had gotten word that there had been trouble at the Shaw property in the night, and his calculation was that trouble meant the widow had been scared sufficiently, and that today was the day she signed. He rode the main street of Amargo in the unhurried manner of a man who is arriving to collect a result he considers already certain, Trace on his left, the hired men behind. He stopped in front of the laundry. Winnie Shaw was at her door. Gideon Cross was 15 feet to her left, in the shadow of the alley between the laundry and the neighboring building, not visible until you were at precisely the right angle, which Ellis Dower was not until he was off his horse and 3 steps up the walk. He stopped. He looked at Gideon Cross. Gideon looked back at him. He laid it out plainly. Pickett was in custody. Hale had sent the telegrams. The claim records were copied and in other hands. 4 people in Amargo had signed statements covering the past 3 weeks. Ellis Dower stood on that walk for a long moment, with his face doing something I couldn't fully read from the mercantile awning. But the posture was the posture of a man whose numbers have come out wrong no matter how many times he runs them. Trace, still mounted, started moving his right hand toward his hip. Winnie Shaw stepped through her door. She was carrying Tom's rifle, not pointing it at anyone, holding it, the way you hold a tool you've decided to use and are perfectly clear about the purpose of. She looked at Trace Dower with an expression I can only describe as very settled, and Trace looked back at her, and his hand stopped. She addressed Ellis. Her voice was steady. Her fences had been cut. Her water had been diverted. Men had come to her land in the middle of the night. The deed was recorded at the county seat and was hers, and she was not signing anything. Ellis looked at her. He looked at Gideon Cross. He looked at the street, where a good portion of Amargo had by now stopped moving. He said this wasn't over. "It is," Gideon Cross said. "Walk away." What happened in the next 4 seconds I have told differently on different nights, but here is the straight account. Ellis Dower reached inside his coat. Whether for a weapon or not I cannot say for certain, and it may be that he himself didn't know yet. That he was one of those men who reaches and decides mid-motion what the hand is going to find. Gideon Cross moved at exactly the same instant that Trace Dower's hand went to his hip, this time for real. The shot that rang out on Amargo Main Street that afternoon was not Gideon's. It was Winnie's. She put a round through the post of the mercantile awning across the street, 8 inches from Trace Dower's head, close enough that splinters hit him in the face. His horse went sideways 3 steps, and then 3 more, and Trace rode it out because whatever else you could say about Trace Dower, he could ride, but his hands were busy with the horse and his face had changed entirely from what it had been a second before. His hands went up. Ellis Dower had not drawn. His hand came back out of his coat empty, and it may be that the shot took the decision away from him before he'd arrived at it. He stood with his hands visible, and he looked at Gideon Cross, and he did the math one final time. The 2 hired men at the back had not moved. They were hired for pressure work, not for standing in the open street in front of a man whose name Pickett had mentioned with that particular expression on his face. They stayed where they were. Ellis Dower told Trace to lower his hands. He told the hired men to ride back to the ranch. He looked at Winnie Shaw one time, a long look that contained a great many things, none of them I would care to name, and then he turned to Gideon Cross. "You've made an enemy." "Started that yourself," Gideon said. "I only finished the morning." Ellis walked back to his horse. He mounted. He rode out of Amargo in the direction of the Kettle Creek Ranch, and he did not look back. The territorial marshal arrived 4 days later. The county sheriff came the following morning. The investigations that followed produced, over the next several months, the full unraveling of the ring. The investors in Tucson and Prescott found themselves defendants in a proceeding that ran 2 years and ended with 3 convictions and the financial ruin of the remaining 5. Ellis Dower sold the Kettle Creek Ranch before the proceedings concluded and left the territory. Trace Dower, who was not the sharpest instrument in any drawer, stayed long enough to give a deposition that damaged him, and left afterward on a horse that didn't belong to him, which created further legal complications in New Mexico territory. Cale Pickett testified for the prosecution and received what was charitably described as a lenient sentence in exchange. That's how it went in those years, and it didn't sit right with most people who knew what Pickett had done. But it was also how the larger case got built. The law makes its trades. Norbert Hale resigned the sheriff's position the same week. He left Amargo about a month later, quietly, without ceremony. I don't know what became of him after that, and I think about that sometimes. Some men carry their choices when they leave. Some men are able to set them down. I never knew which kind Hale was. The county appointed a new sheriff from the territorial list, a young man from Tucson named Delaney, who had no prior history with anyone in Amargo, and who understood from the moment he rode in that his job was partly to be the opposite of what his predecessor had been. He did that job well, by most accounts. He stayed 8 years. By the time he left, the Amargo that existed under Hale's arrangement was largely a memory that the town did not talk about with pride. Winnie Shaw kept her claim. She kept the laundry and the 80 acres and the stock pond on the western edge. The years after the trouble were not easy, because easy was not something the territory distributed freely, but they were hers. The second year she hired a man named Edmund, a Navajo horseman who knew cattle better than anyone in that part of the territory, and together they ran a small herd that was modest in size and consistently healthy and sold well at market. She expanded the adobe eventually, built out the second room properly with lumber, and rented it to a seamstress who came through Amargo one autumn and found a reason to stay. The two of them built the laundry operation into something with 2 pairs of hands and a real sign above the door. I saw her 3 years after the trouble, in early fall when the rains had come ahead of schedule and turned the scrub country green in a way it only does those rare years when the weather cooperates. She was standing at the edge of her property, looking out at the stock pond with a look I recognized. It is the look of people who have kept a thing against the odds and are not yet past being surprised that they did. She looked well. She looked like herself. She looked, if I'm honest, like a woman who had finished a very long fight and had not yet decided what came next. As for Gideon Cross, he left Amargo the morning after Ellis Dower rode out. I was at the hitching post outside Halverson's, same place I'd been 2 days before, and I watched him tie his gear to the bay horse with the methodical care of a man who has done this so many times the motion is nearly unconscious. Winnie came out into the street. She stood a few feet away and looked at him. She did not ask him to stay. She was Winnie Shaw, and asking for things she already knew the answer to was not something she did. He told her the county sheriff's men would arrive within the week, that the records were secured and the statement signed, and she was as covered as he knew how to make her. She thanked him. Directly, without ceremony, in the way she did everything. She said what he'd done had given her the space to do what she needed to do, and that she would not forget it. He nodded. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that had no easy name, and for a beat I thought it was going to change the shape of what was between them. Find words or an acknowledgement or some signal of what this had been beyond what it appeared to be. But Gideon Cross was a man who had learned a long time ago that the territory keeps moving, and that he moves with it, and whatever was in his face went back down to wherever he kept things he didn't say. He mounted. He rode south on the post road. He didn't look back, not that I could see. There is a version of that moment that people retell as a romance, the mysterious gunslinger and the brave widow, and the unspoken thing between them, the road not taken. I have heard that version many times. I don't think it's wrong exactly. I think it misses the point, which is that Gideon Cross was a man the frontier kept sending from one fire to the next, and that Winnie Shaw had found her ground and intended to keep it, and that safety is sometimes the most loving thing one person can give another, even when safety requires leaving to deliver it. He gave her safety. She kept her ground. I have spent a long time in this territory, friend, and I have seen a great deal of what men do to women when they believe no one of consequence is watching. What I learned from watching Gideon Cross step into that street with nothing but a single sentence is that consequence sometimes arrives unexpected, wearing road dust and carrying a flour sack. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't always know, walking in, the full shape of what it's walking into. But when it sees what it sees, it moves. And what I learned from Winnie Shaw is that staying is an act of will that doesn't get spoken about enough, because it is quiet, and it is daily, and it doesn't make for a story the way a gunfight does. But it is the harder thing most times. Tom Shaw knew it when he built that stock pond. Winnie Shaw knew it every morning she declined to go. Every afternoon she carried water from the town well in the heat. Every evening she lit her lamp and kept working. The land is hers. She earned it twice over. Now, friend, this story was brought to you as it happened, to the best of my recollection and what the records will support, out of Amargo, Arizona Territory, summer of 1883. The characters in it are fictional. The events are the product of this storyteller's imagination, offered in the tradition of frontier yarns that have been passed along since there was a West worth calling wild. No real persons are depicted or intended. If you've been listening from somewhere far from here, drop a word in the comments. Tell me where you are tonight and what time it is where you're sitting. I like to think about all the different corners of the world where these stories land, all the different fires they're told beside. If it meant something to you, subscribe. New stories come out regular as we can manage them, and there are more voices from this territory we haven't gotten to yet. Ride careful, friend. I'll see you on the next one.